I write about Agnes. I try to imagine her. I let her sit on a bench in the sauna, walk around Paris, leaf through a magazine, talk with her husband. But the thing that started it all, the gesture of a woman waving to a lifeguard by the side of a pool, it must seem as if I had forgotten that. Does Agnes any longer wave to anyone in this manner? No. Strange as it seems, I believe that she has not done so for many years. Long ago, when she was very young, yes, in those days she used to wave like that. At that time, she was still living in a Swiss town surrounded by mountaintops, silhouetted in the distance. She was 16 and went to the movies with a school friend. The instant the lights went out, he took her hand. Soon their palms became sticky, but the boy did not dare let go of the hand he had so daringly grasped, for that would have meant admitting that he was perspiring and ashamed of it. And so they sat with clammy hands for an hour and a half, and let go only when the lights came back on. He tried to prolong the date, leading her down the streets of the old part of town and then uphill to the courtyard of an old cloister teeming with tourists. He obviously had thought out everything in advance because he led her quite briskly to a deserted passage, under the rather trite pretense that he wanted to show her a certain painting. They reached the end of the passage, but instead of a picture, there was only a dark brown door, marked with the letters WC. The boy had not noticed the sign and stopped. She knew perfectly well that he was not very interested in paintings and that he was only looking for a secluded place where he could kiss her. Poor boy. He had found nothing better than a dirty corner next to a lavatory. She burst out laughing, and to make it clear that she wasn't laughing at him, she pointed out the sign. He laughed too, but he was seized by hopelessness. It was impossible to hug and kiss her with those letters in the background, all the more since this was to be their first and thus an unforgettable kiss. And so he had no choice but to turn back with a bitter sense of capitulation. They walked silently, and Agnes was angry. Why didn't he simply kiss her in the middle of the street? Why did he have to lead her instead down an obscure passage to a lavatory where generations of old and ugly and smelly monks had been relieving themselves? His embarrassment flattered her because it was a sign of his bewildered love, but it irritated her even more because it testified to his immaturity. Going with a boy the same age seemed like lowering oneself. She was only interested in older boys. But perhaps because she thus was secretly rejecting him and yet knew at the same time that he was in love with her, a sense of justice prompted her to help him in his amorous efforts, to support him, to rid him of childish embarrassment. She resolved that if he couldn't find the necessary courage, she would. He was walking her home, and she planned that the moment they reached the gate of her house, she would throw her arms around him and kiss him, which would no doubt make him stand stock still, completely flabbergasted. But at the last moment, she lost the desire to do so, because his face was not merely sad, but forbidding, even hostile. And so they merely shook hands, and she walked off down the garden path to her door. She sensed that the boy remained standing motionless, gazing after her. She felt sorry for him once more. She felt for him the compassion of an older sister. And at that point, she did something quite unpremeditated. As she kept on walking, she turned her head back toward him, smiled, and lifted her right arm in the air, easily, flowingly, as if she were tossing a brightly colored ball. That instant when Agnes suddenly, without preparation, lifted her arm in a flowing, easy motion was miraculous. How was it possible that in a single fraction of a second, and for the very first time, she discovered a motion of the arm and body so perfect and polished that it resembled a finished work of art? In those days, a woman of about 40 used to come to see father. She was the departmental secretary, and she would bring papers for him to sign and take other papers back with her. Even though these visits had no special significance, they were accompanied by a mysterious tension. Mother would always turn silent, arousing Agnes's curiosity. Whenever the secretary was leaving, Agnes ran to the window to watch her inconspicuously. Once, as she was heading toward the gate, thus walking in a direction opposite to that which Agnes was to take somewhat later, followed by the gaze of her unfortunate school friend, the secretary turned, smiled, and lifted her arm in the air in an unexpected gesture, easy and flowing. It was an unforgettable moment. The sandy path sparkled in the rays of the sun like a golden stream, and on both sides of the gate jasmine bushes were blooming. It was as if the upward gesture wished to show this golden piece of earth the direction of flight. while the white jasmine bushes were already beginning to turn into wings. Father was not visible, but the woman's gesture indicated that he was standing in the doorway of the villa, gazing after her. That gesture was so unexpected and beautiful that it remained in Agnes's memory like the imprint of a lightning bolt. It invited her into the depths of space and time and awakened in the 16-year-old girl a vague and immense longing. At the moment when she suddenly needed to say something important to her school friend and had no words for it, that gesture came to life and said on her behalf what she herself was unable to say. I don't know how long she kept using it, or more precisely how long it kept using her, but surely up to the day when she noticed her sister, younger by 8 years, tossing up her arm while saying goodbye to a girlfriend. When she saw her gesture, performed by a sister who had been admiring and imitating her from earliest childhood, she felt a certain unease. The adult gesture did not fit an 11-year-old child, but more important, she realized that the gesture was available to all and thus did not really belong to her. When she waved her arm, she was actually committing theft or forgery. From that time on, she began to avoid that gesture. It is not easy to break the habit of gestures that have become used to us. And she developed a distrust of gestures altogether. She tried to limit herself to the most important ones, to nod yes or shake her head no, to point at an object her companion had failed to see, to use only gestures that did not pretend to be her original expression. And so it came to be that the bewitching gesture of Father's secretary walking down the golden path, which bewitched me when I saw the woman in the swimsuit take leave of the lifeguard, had completely gone to sleep in her. And then one day it awoke. It happened before Mother's death, when she was staying 2 weeks in the villa with her sick father. As she was saying goodbye to him on that last day, she knew that they wouldn't see each other again for a long time. Mother wasn't at home, and Father wanted to see her to her car, which was parked in the street. She forbade him to accompany her beyond the door, and walked alone over the golden sand past the flower beds to the gate. She had a lump in her throat and an enormous yearning. She had a lump in her throat and an enormous yearning to say something beautiful to Father, something that could not be expressed by words. And so, without quite knowing how it happened, she suddenly turned her head and, with a smile, tossed her arm in the air easily, flowingly, as if to tell him they still had a long life ahead of them and would still see each other many more times. An instant later, she recalled the 40-year-old woman who, 25 years earlier, had stood in the same place and had waved at her father in the same way. That upset and confused her. It was as if two distant times had suddenly met in a single second, and two different women in a single gesture. The thought passed through her head that those two women might have been the only ones he had ever loved. In the salon, where they were all sitting after dinner over glasses of brandy and half-finished cups of coffee, the first courageous guest rose to his feet and bowed with a smile to the lady of the house. The others decided to take it as a signal, and along with Paul and Agnes jumped out of their armchairs and hurried to their cars. Paul drove. Agnes sat next to him and absorbed the incessant movement of traffic, the blinking of lights, the pointless agitation of a metropolitan night. And she once again had the strong, peculiar feeling that was coming over her more and more often. The feeling that she had nothing in common with those two-legged creatures with a head on their shoulders and a mouth in their face. There was a time when she was interested in their politics, their science, their inventions, when she considered herself a small part of their great adventure, until one day the feeling was born in her that she did not belong among them. That feeling was strange. She resisted it. She knew that it was absurd as well as amoral. But in the end, she told herself that she could not command her feelings. She was no longer able to torment herself with thoughts of their wars, nor to enjoy their celebrations, because she was filled with the conviction that none of it was her concern. Man, that's good. Did it mean that she was cold-hearted? No, it had nothing to do with the heart. Anyway, nobody handed out as much money to beggars as she. She could never ignore them as she passed them on the street, and they, as if they sensed it, turned to her, picking her out at once from a throng of 100 other pedestrians as the one who saw and heard them. Yes, it is true, but I must add the following. Even her handouts to beggars were based on negation. She gave them money not because beggars too belong to mankind, but because they did not belong to it. Because they were excluded from it and probably, like her, felt no solidarity with mankind. No solidarity with mankind. That was her attitude. Only one thing could wrench her out of it: concrete love toward a concrete person. If she truly loved someone, she could not be indifferent to the fate of other people, because her beloved would be dependent on that fate. He would be part of it. And she could no longer feel that mankind's torments, its wars and holidays, were none of her concern. She was frightened by that last thought. Was it true that she didn't love anyone? And what about Paul? She thought of the moment a few hours earlier before they had left for dinner when he had taken her in his arms. Yes, something was going on inside her. Recently, she was pursued by the idea that her love for Paul was merely a matter of will. Merely the will to love him, merely the will to have a happy marriage. If she eased up on this will for just a moment, love would fly away like a bird released from its cage. It is 1 o'clock at night. Agnes and Paul are undressing. If they were asked to describe their partner's motions at such times, they would be embarrassed. For a long time now, they haven't been looking at each other. Disconnected, their instrument of memory fails to record anything of those common nighttime moments that precede lying down in the marital bed. The marital bed, the altar of marriage. And when one says altar, one implies sacrifice. Here, one of them sacrifices for the other. Both have trouble falling asleep, and their partner's noisy breathing wakes them, so they wriggle toward the edge of the bed, leaving a broad space down the middle. They pretend to be sound asleep in the hope of making sleep easier for their partner, who will then be able to turn from side to side without disturbing the other. Unfortunately, the partner does not make use of this opportunity because he too, and for the same reason, pretends to be asleep and fears to budge. Not being able to fall asleep and not allowing oneself to move. The marital bed. Agnes is stretched out on her back and images keep passing through her head. That strange, kindly man is visiting them again, the one who knows all about them and yet has not heard of the Eiffel Tower. She would give anything to be able to talk with him in private, but he deliberately chose a time when both of them were at home. In vain, Agnes tries to think of a ruse to get Paul out of the house. The three of them are sitting around a low table with 3 cups of coffee, and Paul is trying to entertain the visitor. Agnes is only waiting for the guest to start speaking about his reason for coming. Actually, she knows the reason, but only she knows. Paul doesn't. At last, the visitor interrupts Paul's conversation and comes to the point. You, I believe, have guessed where I'm from. Yes, says Agnes. She knows that the guest has come from another distant planet, one with an important status in the universe, and she quickly adds with a shy smile, "Is life better over there?" The visitor only shrugs. Agnes, surely you know where you are living. Agnes says, perhaps death must exist, but was there no other way to arrange things. Is it really necessary for a person to leave a body behind, a body that must be buried in the ground or thrown into a fire? It's also horrible. That's well known all over, that Earth is horrible, says the visitor. And another thing, says Agnes. Perhaps you'll consider this question silly. Those who live in your place, do they have faces? No. Faces exist nowhere else but here. So then, those who live over there, how do they differ from one another? They're all their own creations. Everybody, so to speak, thinks himself up. But it's hard to talk about it. You cannot grasp it. You will someday. I came to tell you that in the next life, you won't return to Earth. Of course, Agnes knew in advance what the visitor would say to them, and she is hardly surprised. But Paul is amazed. He looks at the visitor, looks at Agnes, and she has no choice but to say, "And Paul?" "Paul won't stay here either," says the visitor. I've come to tell you that. We always tell people we have selected. I only want to ask you one question. Do you want to stay together in your next life or never meet again? Agnes knew the question was coming. That was the reason she wanted to be alone with the visitor. She knew that in Paul's presence she would be incapable of saying, "I no longer want to be with him." She could not say it in front of him, nor he in front of her, even though it is probable that he too would prefer to try living the next life differently without Agnes. Yet saying aloud to each other's face, "We don't want to remain together in the next life," would amount to saying no love ever existed between us, and no love exists between us now. And that's precisely what is so impossible to say aloud. For their entire life together, already over 20 years of life together, has been based on the illusion of love, an illusion that both of them have been anxiously guarding and nurturing. And so whenever she imagined this scene, she knew that when it came to the visitor's question, she would capitulate and declare against her wishes, against her desire, "Yes, of course, I want us to be together in the next life." But today, for the first time, she was certain that even in Paul's presence, she would find the courage to say what she wanted, what she really wanted in the depth of her soul. She was certain that she would find this courage even at the price of ruining everything between them. Next to her, she heard the sound of loud breathing. Paul had really fallen asleep, as if she were putting the same reel of film back in the projector. She ran through the whole scene once again. She's speaking to the visitor. Paul is watching them with astonishment, and the guest is saying, "In your next life, do you want to stay together and never meet again?" It is strange. Even though he has all the necessary information about them, terrestrial psychology is incomprehensible to him. The concept of love, unfamiliar, so he cannot guess what a difficult situation he would create by his sincere, practical, and well-intended question. Agnes gathers all her inner strength and answers in a firm voice, "We prefer never to meet again." These words are like the click of a door shutting on the illusion of love. Jam.